$50, 3 prime winter bear hides, and a mule loaded with salted meat. That was the going rate for a human life in Oakhaven. Julian Miller paraded his daughters like cattle at a Sunday livestock auction, desperate to clear a gambling debt that threatened his kneecaps. The mountain man stood in the parlor mud, smelling of pine pitch, old blood, and damp wool, studying the women. He didn't want the pretty ones. He wanted the one wedged in the back, the heavy girl with lie-burned hands and a scowl. Dust hung thick in the front room of the Miller cabin, trapped in the harsh shafts of afternoon sun bleeding through a cracked window pane. The air tasted of stale pipe tobacco, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, sour tang of desperation. Julian Miller paced the warped floorboards, his boots making a pathetic, hollow sound. He rubbed his hands together, the knuckles white, his smile slick with sweat and false hospitality. Martha stood by the cold wood stove, trying to shrink into the cast iron. It was a futile effort. She was a mountain of a girl, broad-shouldered, thick-waisted, her heavy breasts constrained by a frayed cotton bodice that dug viciously into her ribs. Sweat pooled beneath her arms and trickled down the valley of her spine, itching intensely. She didn't wipe it away. Movement drew attention, and attention in this house usually meant a chore or an insult. Beside her, shifted forward into the better light, were her sisters, Clara and Jane. They were whittled down by the same poverty that had somehow made Martha expand. Clara was all sharp collarbones and wide, hungry eyes, currently pinching her cheeks to force a bloom of color into the sallow skin. Jane was younger, prettier, practically vibrating with the hope that this massive, terrifying stranger might be her ticket out of Oakhaven. He had ridden in 10 minutes ago. No warning, just the heavy thud of hooves in the dirt yard and a fist hammering on the warped pine door. Now he stood in their parlor. He was a slab of a man. Martha noted the details with a cynical, detached eye. His buckskin coat was blackened with years of grease and smoke. His beard was a tangled thicket of dark blonde, hiding the lower half of his face, but his eyes were visible, pale, flat blue, like the sky right before a hard freeze. He didn't fidget. He didn't look at Julian, who was currently babbling about how hard his girls worked, how biddable they were, how they knew the Bible back to front. "Choose any daughter you want," Julian said, his voice cracking on the final word. He gestured magnanimously towards the three of them. It was a vile piece of theatre. Julian didn't care about their souls or their futures. He cared about the heavy leather pouch tied to the stranger's belt and the mules tied to the rotting fence outside. Martha ground her teeth together. Her jaw ached with the force of it. She hated her father in that moment, but the hatred was old and tired, lacking the fiery heat it had when she was younger. Now it was just a dull, heavy stone in her gut. She waited for the stranger to point at Jane. It was always Jane. Jane was the sort of girl men wanted to rescue. Martha was the sort of girl men asked to help move a stuck wagon. The mountain man shifted his weight. His boots, crusted with dried mud and something dark that looked suspiciously like dried blood, creaked. The smell of him filled the small room, overpowering the stale tobacco. It was an offensive, raw scent. Crushed pine needles, wet animal fur, and a metallic sharpness she couldn't place. He ignored Julian completely. He stepped forward. Clara sucked in a breath, thrusting her meager chest out. Jane lowered her eyelashes, a practiced, pathetic flutter. The man walked right past them. Martha didn't realize he was coming toward her until his shadow fell over her, blocking out the dusty sunlight. Up close, he was terrifying. He carried the quiet, heavy stillness of a rock slide waiting to happen. She kept her eyes fixed on the center of his chest, right where a leather thong held a yellowed bear claw. Her heart gave a thick, painful thud against her ribs. She was suddenly hyper-aware of her own smell. Lye soap, old sweat, and the grease from the morning's bacon. "Show me your hands," he said. His voice was like two rough stones grinding together. It hadn't been used for casual conversation in a long time. Martha blinked, her gaze snapping up to his face. The pale eyes were studying her intensely, devoid of the disgust she was accustomed to seeing from town men. There was no mockery, just calculation. She hesitated, her heavy jaw setting stubbornly. "Why?" Julian gasped, scrambling forward. "Martha, you mind your tongue and do as the gentleman asks. I apologize, mister. She's got a temper on her, but she don't mean nothing by it." The stranger raised a single massive hand, a silent command that snapped Julian's jaw shut instantly. He looked back at Martha. He didn't repeat the demand. He just waited. Resentment flared, hot and sudden, but survival instinct smothered it. Martha slowly raised her hands. They were large, the fingers thick like sausages, the knuckles red and swollen. Calluses, yellowed and hard as horn, padded her palms from years of gripping washboards, chopping wood, and hauling iron pots. The nails were blunt, packed with dirt she couldn't scrub out. They were ugly hands, working hands. The stranger reached out. His fingers wrapped around hers. Martha flinched. The jolt was involuntary. His hand was rougher than hers, the skin like cured rawhide, but it was incredibly warm. It was not a gentle touch. He turned her hands over, his thumb pressing hard into the thick calluses at the base of her fingers, then trailing up to test the joints. He was handling her the way a man inspects a plow mule before putting down coin. A flush of deep, humiliating heat crept up Martha's thick neck, coloring her cheeks a dull, mottled red. It wasn't the blush of a maiden being courted. It was the furious shame of being reduced to livestock. She tried to pull her hands back, but his grip was iron. "Bones are thick," the man murmured, more to himself than to her. He dropped her hands abruptly. He took a half-step back, his eyes dragging down her form. He didn't look at her breasts or her hips with the leering gaze of the drunks at the tavern. He looked at the breadth of her shoulders, the solid, tree-trunk thickness of her thighs under the cheap cotton skirt. He was assessing her mass. "This one," the stranger said. He didn't point. He just looked at Julian over his shoulder. The room dropped into a profound, suffocating silence. You could hear the wind rattling the loose clapboards outside. Julian's mouth opened and closed like a dying trout. He looked from the mountain man to Martha, then back again. "Her!" he choked out. Jane let out a small, indignant squeak. Clara just stared, her pale eyes wide with shock. "Her!" the stranger confirmed. He reached to his belt, untied the heavy leather pouch, and tossed it. It hit Julian squarely in the chest. Julian fumbled to catch it, the heavy clinking sound of coins spilling into the quiet room. $50. The hides and the meat are on the mule. You take the cargo, I take the saddle." Julian weighed the pouch in his trembling hands, greed fighting a losing battle with utter confusion. "Mister, I don't aim to cheat you, she's—" Julian swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Martha. "She eats a fair amount. It takes a lot to keep her moving. And she ain't exactly a picture to look at across a supper table. Jane here, she's a fine cook, and she sews right pretty—" "I don't need a picture," the man interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a subtle threat that made Julian take a hurried step backward. "I need a woman who won't freeze to death when the snow hits the roof line. I need a woman who won't blow away in a high ridge wind. I need someone who can carry a quartered elk without breaking her spine." He looked back at Martha. "She's built for winter. I'll take her." Built for winter. Martha stood perfectly still. The insult wrapped in a twisted compliment hit her square in the chest. She wasn't chosen for love, or lust, or even basic affection. She was chosen because she was fat, because she had enough meat on her bones to survive a brutal freeze, because she was strong enough to do the work of a beast of burden. She felt a bitter, acidic laugh bubbling in the back of her throat. She swallowed it down. What did she expect? A knight in shining armor? This was Oakhaven. This was reality. Pack your things, the stranger told her. It wasn't a request. Martha didn't look at her father or her sisters. She turned her broad back to them and walked heavily toward the small, curtained alcove she shared with Jane and Clara. The floorboards groaned in protest under her boots. Her packing took exactly 3 minutes. She owned practically nothing. She pulled a stained flour sack from beneath her cot and shoved in her spare work dress, a pair of thick wool socks with darned heels, a cracked horn comb, and a small rusted tin containing a sliver of lye soap. She paused, her fingers brushing against a small, dried bundle of sage tucked in the corner of her mattress. The only thing in the house that smelled decent. She shoved that into the sack, too. When she emerged, Julian was already out the door, gleefully unloading the salted meat from the stranger's pack mule. Clara and Jane were standing by the stove, watching her with a mix of pity and profound relief. They were safe. The monster had taken the fat sister. The mountain man was waiting by the open door. The cold autumn wind whipped past him, bringing the sharp scent of turning leaves and dust. "Ready?" he asked. "Do I have a choice?" Martha replied, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He didn't smile. He just tipped his head slightly. "Name's Caleb. Martha." She walked past him, stepping out into the biting wind, clutching her flour sack to her chest. She didn't look back at the cabin. There was nothing in there worth remembering. The roan horse Caleb had brought for her was tall, heavily muscled, and looked mean. It snorted, stamping a massive hoof into the dirt as Martha approached. She eyed the stirrup. It hung impossibly high. Caleb walked up behind her. She braced herself, waiting for the humiliating moment where he would have to hoist her up, waiting for the grunt of exertion, the inevitable sigh at her weight. Instead, he walked past her to the horse's head, grabbing the bridle close to the bit. "Who's the stump?" he said, nodding toward a rotting piece of timber near the fence line. Relief, sharp and sudden, cut through her anxiety. He wasn't going to touch her again. He wasn't going to make a spectacle of her size. Martha dragged the heavy block of wood over, her boots slipping in the mud. She stepped up, gripped the saddle horn with both calloused hands, and hauled her bulk upward. The horse let out a grunt and shifted hard to the side as her weight settled into the saddle. The leather creaked violently. Martha flushed, her hands tightening on the reins, waiting for the saddle girth to snap. It held. Caleb didn't say a word. He swung up onto his own horse, a ragged-looking grey gelding, in one fluid motion, catching the lead rope of the now empty pack mule. He clicked his tongue, and the horses moved out. They rode in silence. The town of Oakhaven fell away behind them quickly, the shacks and muddy streets giving way to rolling foothills covered in scrub oak and dying yellow grass. The wooden tree of the saddle was hard, the leather stiff and uncared for. Within the first hour, the friction began to burn the soft, thick flesh of Martha's inner thighs through her cotton skirt. She shifted her weight, trying to find a comfortable position, but there was none. Every step the heavy roan took jarred her spine. She watched Caleb's back. He rode slouched, relaxed, moving with the animal rather than fighting it. The wind picked up, whipping his greasy hair around his collar. He never looked back to check on her. He simply assumed she was following. As the afternoon dragged into evening, the incline sharpened. The scrub oak thinned out, replaced by towering, ancient ponderosa pines. The air changed. Down in the valley, it had been thick with dust and the smell of rot. Up here, the air was thin, cold, and tasted of ozone and sap. Each breath stung the back of Martha's throat. The temperature plummeted as the sun dipped behind the jagged granite peaks to the west. Martha shivered, her thin shawl doing nothing to stop the biting wind from cutting through to her skin. Her heavy flesh, usually a furnace that made her sweat in the dead of winter, felt cold and clammy. "We camp here." Caleb's voice broke the hours of silence. It startled her so badly she jerked the reins, making her horse toss its head angrily. They were in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine. A small stream trickled over slick, black rocks nearby. Caleb dismounted and began uncinching his saddle. Martha tried to dismount gracefully, but her legs were numb and trembling from the cold and the unnatural spread of the saddle. As she swung her leg over, her boot caught on the cantle. She fell heavily, landing with a solid, breathless thump in the dirt and pine needles. She froze, eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the laughter, waiting for the mocking comment. Clumsy cow, useless fat sow. She had heard them all her life. The only sound was the rustle of wind in the pines and the jingling of the horse's bit. She opened her eyes. Caleb was 10 feet away, unbuckling the pack mule. He hadn't even looked over. A strange, contradictory knot twisted in Martha's chest. She was grateful he hadn't seen her fall, but a tiny, cynical part of her stung at being entirely ignored. She pushed herself up, her knees aching, brushing pine needles off her dirty skirt. Caleb built a fire quickly, his movements efficient and practiced. He didn't ask for her help, and she didn't offer it. She sat on a fallen log near the flames, holding her hands out, desperate for the heat. He walked over and dropped a hard, unyielding mass into her lap. She picked it up. It was a chunk of dried venison jerky, dark as coal and tough as shoe leather. "Eat," he said, sitting on his heels across the fire. He tore off a piece of his own jerky with his teeth, chewing methodically. Martha looked at the dry meat, then at him. "Is this it?" she asked, the words out before she could stop them. Caleb paused, the firelight casting harsh, dancing shadows across the deep scar that jagged down his left cheek. He swallowed. "You expect a roasted chicken? You should have stayed in the valley." The bluntness of it slapped her. I didn't expect anything," she snapped back, her voice thick with the defensive anger she used as armor. "I just asked a question." She bit into the jerky. It tasted of salt, old smoke, and animal. It took immense effort just to tear a piece free. She chewed aggressively, glaring at the fire. Caleb watched her for a long moment, his flat blue eyes reflecting the orange flames. "You chew loud," he stated simply. Martha stopped chewing, her mouth full, her face burning. She swallowed heavily, the dry meat scratching its way down her throat. "Then don't listen." To her absolute shock, the corner of Caleb's mouth twitched upward, hidden almost entirely by his beard. It was gone in a fraction of a second, but she saw it. A ghost of a smile. "Get some sleep," he told her, standing up to check the horses. "Tomorrow we climb above the tree line. It gets colder." Martha sat alone by the fire, holding her piece of dried meat. She was freezing, sore, and miles away from the miserable place she had called home. She looked at her thick, scarred hands in the firelight. She had been bought to be a draft horse. But as she listened to Caleb quietly talking to his gelding in the dark, she realized something unsettling. She wasn't afraid of him, and that scared her more than the mountain cold. Morning came not with a gradual lightening of the sky, but with a brittle, grey creeping that seemed to seep out of the frost itself. Martha woke with a gasp, her lungs snatching at the thin air. The wool blanket covering her was stiff with frozen dew. Every joint in her body screamed in protest as she forced herself upright. Her hips felt as though they had been pried apart with an iron crowbar, the legacy of a full day straddling the wide barrel of the roan horse. She looked across the dead ashes of the fire. Caleb was already up. He stood by the horses, running a stiff bristled brush over the gelding's coat. The rhythmic shh sound was the only noise in the heavy mountain quiet. He didn't offer a morning greeting. He didn't even look her way. Martha dragged herself off the frozen ground. Her bladder ached, and her mouth tasted of stale jerky and morning rot. She hobbled behind a thick stand of junipers to relieve herself, the biting wind instantly numbing her exposed flesh. When she returned, Caleb had the pack mule loaded and was tightening the cinch on her saddle. "We lose the trees by noon," he said. He didn't look up from the leather strap. "Wind gets worse." Martha didn't answer. She walked to the stump they had dragged along for her to mount, gripped the icy saddle horn, and hauled her massive frame upward. The roan grunted, sidestepping, but she was too cold to care about the animal's discomfort. Her heavy cotton skirt was entirely inadequate. The dampness from yesterday's sweat had frozen into the fibers, turning the garment into a stiff, abrasive shell against her chafed thighs. They rode upward. The ponderosa pines gradually gave way to twisted, skeletal spruce trees that clung desperately to the granite slopes. Then, even the spruce vanished, leaving nothing but jagged grey rock, patches of coarse yellow lichen, and the vast, uncaring expanse of a steel-coloured sky. The wind hit them like a physical blow. It didn't howl, it roared. It was a sustained, violent force that threatened to strip the skin right off Martha's face. She bowed her head, burying her chin into her chest, her eyes watering so heavily her vision blurred into a watery smear of grey and brown. The cold was profound. It bypassed her skin and settled deep into the marrow of her heavy bones. Her fingers, gripping the reins, lost all sensation, turning into useless wooden blocks. An hour past the timberline, the sleet began. It wasn't snow, it was tiny hard pellets of ice that drove horizontally on the wind, stinging her exposed cheeks like buckshot. The roan lowered its head, its ears pinned back flat, its massive hooves slipping on the ice-slicked rock. Caleb pulled his gelding to a halt. The wind swallowed the sound of the hooves instantly. He turned in the saddle, looking back at her. Through the driving sleet, Martha squinted at him, expecting him to yell at her to hurry up, to stop letting her horse lag. Instead, he swung down from his saddle. He walked to the pack mule, his boots crunching on the accumulating ice. He dug under the canvas tarp and pulled out a massive, shapeless bundle. He walked back to her horse and threw the bundle up at her. It hit her in the chest, heavy and stiff. Martha fumbled with her numb hands, catching it before it slid into the mud. It was a coat, a buffalo hide duster, the fur turned inward. It smelled atrocious, a thick, gagging odor of rancid animal fat, old blood, and wood smoke. "Put it on," Caleb yelled, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Martha didn't argue. She let the reins drop and wrestled her arms into the heavy sleeves. The coat was enormous, built for a man Caleb's size, but it fit her broad shoulders perfectly. The moment she wrapped the thick hide around her torso, the biting wind was severed. The crude, greasy wool inside trapped her body heat almost instantly. It was the ugliest, foulest-smelling garment she had ever touched, and it felt like absolute salvation. "Get down," Caleb commanded. Martha blinked, confused. "What?" "Get down. Horse is carrying too much weight on slick rock. We walk the ridge." A flare of resentment pierced through her numb exhaustion. Of course, she was too heavy. She was a burden to the beast. She clumsily swung her leg over and dropped to the ground. Her numb feet hit the rock, sending a jarring spike of pain all the way up her spine to the base of her skull. She staggered, her heavy thighs trembling as they tried to support her weight on the uneven, icy slope. Caleb took the roan's lead rope, holding it in the same hand as his gelding's. He started walking. Martha followed. The air was so thin here that every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. Her lungs heaved, expanding her broad chest against the heavy buffalo coat. She was carrying well over 200 pounds of her own flesh, plus the heavy hide, up a 30-degree incline in a sleet storm. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. Sweat broke out on her forehead, freezing instantly in the wind. "He's trying to kill me," she thought, a dark, cynical voice echoing in her pounding head. "He bought me to freeze me to death on a ridge." But when she looked up, gasping for air, she saw Caleb wasn't leaving her behind. He was a long-legged man, built for covering ground, yet he was taking short, deliberate steps. He was matching his pace to her heavy, plodding boots. He didn't look back to check on her, nor did he offer a hand, but he didn't let the distance between them grow beyond 10 feet. It was an agonizing trek. The sleet turned to heavy, wet snow, clinging to the buffalo coat and weighing her down further. Martha kept her eyes fixed on the muddy heels of Caleb's boots. She placed her boots in the exact tracks his boots left in the snow. She fell into a brutal rhythm. Step, heave a breath. Step, heave a breath. Her mind went blank, stripped of all complex thought, reduced to the raw, fundamental mechanics of survival. She didn't know how long they walked. Time compressed into a blur of grey snow, burning lungs, and the rhythmic crunch of boots on ice. Just as her vision began to narrow, the edges going dark with lack of oxygen, the wind suddenly died. Martha stumbled, catching her balance on a boulder. She looked up, wiping a thick layer of wet snow from her eyelashes. They had crested the ridge and dropped down into a bowl-shaped depression in the mountain, shielded on 3 sides by towering walls of black granite. Nestled into the deepest corner of the rock face, almost entirely obscured by a thick roof of turf and snow, was a cabin. It wasn't a house. It was a bunker. The cabin was built low to the ground, constructed of massive, unpeeled pine logs notched together with brutal efficiency. The gaps were chinked with hardened mud and moss. There were no windows. A single heavy plank door faced the small clearing, shielded by an overhanging lip of the granite cliff above. Caleb led the horses to a small, 3-sided lean-to attached to the rock wall. "Go inside," he told Martha, his voice raspy from the cold. Martha waded through the knee-deep snow towards the cabin. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely lift the heavy iron latch. She threw her weight against the door, and it scraped inward over a warped floorboard. She stepped inside and stood frozen. It was pitch black, save for the weak, grey light spilling in from the open doorway. The air was stagnant, colder than the outside air, and smelled heavily of old ash, cured hides, and mice. There was no floor, just hard-packed, frozen earth. As her eyes adjusted, the layout revealed itself. It was one room, no larger than her father's parlor back in Oakhaven. A rusted cast-iron stove squatted in the center, a tin pipe running straight up through the turf roof. A rope bed with a sagging mattress of pine boughs sat in one corner. The walls were hung with iron traps, bundles of dried roots, and coils of rope. It was primitive. It was filthy. And yet, as Martha stood there, shivering uncontrollably inside the massive buffalo coat, a strange, heavy sense of relief washed over her. There were no sneering sisters here. There was no father tallying up the cost of her meals. There were no townsfolk whispering about her size behind their hands. It was just an empty, quiet box of wood and stone. Caleb ducked through the doorway, carrying 2 heavy saddlebags and a load of split firewood. He dropped the wood by the stove with a deafening clatter. "Flint is in the tin on the table," he said, moving back towards the door. "Get a fire going. I have to tend the stock." He pulled the door shut behind him, plunging the room into near total darkness. Martha stood alone. For a second, the overwhelming urge to sit on the frozen dirt and cry gripped her. The exhaustion was absolute. But crying wouldn't generate heat, and the cold was turning her damp clothes into a second skin of ice. She felt her way to a crude, split-log table near the wall. Her numb fingers fumbled over the rough wood until they knocked against a small metal tin. Inside were a piece of flint, a heavy steel striker, and a wad of dry, shredded cedar bark. She moved to the stove. The cast-iron door squealed as she pulled it open. She knelt, her knees popping loudly in the quiet room. Her hands were clumsy. She scraped the steel against the flint, sending a weak shower of orange sparks into the dark. They died instantly. She tried again. Scrape. Nothing. Frustration, hot and desperate, flared in her chest. She gripped the steel tighter, her thick fingers white-knuckled, and struck the flint with violent force. A thick spray of sparks caught the cedar bark. A tiny curl of smoke rose, followed by a fragile orange flame. Martha leaned in, blowing gently, her breath coaxing the fire to spread. She fed it small twigs from the woodpile, then thicker branches, until the fire was roaring, hungry and bright. She shoved a thick log inside and slammed the iron door shut. She didn't stand up. She stayed on her knees, pressing her hands close to the warming iron. She shrugged out of the foul-smelling buffalo coat, letting it drop to the dirt floor, and leaned her broad back against the side of the stove. As the iron heated, a deep, agonizing, prickling sensation began in her fingers and toes, the painful process of flesh thawing out. She clamped her jaw shut, riding out the pain in silence. 20 minutes later, the door opened. Caleb stepped in, bringing a swirl of snowflakes with him. He kicked the door shut and stomped his boots. He looked at the stove, glowing a dull cherry red at its base, radiating a fierce, dry heat that was rapidly pushing the damp cold out of the cabin. Then he looked at Martha, who was still sitting on the floor beside it. He didn't praise her. He didn't thank her. He simply walked to a wooden shelf, grabbed an iron skillet, and set it on the flat top of the stove. "There's salt pork in the canvas bag," he said, stripping off his heavy buckskin coat and hanging it on a wooden peg. "And a bucket for snowmelt. We need water." Martha looked at him. He was wearing a filthy wool undershirt, his broad back heavily muscled and scarred. He was treating her exactly as he had bought her to be, a worker, a partner in the brute mechanics of staying alive. There were no expectations of feminine grace, no demand for pleasantries. She pushed herself up off the dirt floor. Her joints ached, but the core of her body was finally warm. She walked to the canvas bag, opened it, and pulled out a heavy slab of salt-cured meat. It was frozen solid. She took a heavy knife from the table and began sawing off thick, fatty slices. She dropped the meat into the hot skillet. The fat hissed and spat instantly, filling the small cabin with the rich, heavy smell of grease and salt. It was a glorious smell. Caleb sat on a stump near the table, watching her. He watched the capable, heavy way she moved. She didn't flutter. She didn't complain about the smoke stinging her eyes. She took the tin bucket, stepped out into the freezing wind for 10 seconds, scooped it full of clean snow, and set it on the back of the stove to melt. She plated the fried pork on 2 battered tin plates, pouring the hot liquid grease over a few hardtack biscuits she found in the saddlebags. She set a plate in front of him, then took her own, and sat on the edge of the rope bed across the room. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the wood in the stove, the howling of the wind outside, and the scrape of tin forks. Martha chewed the tough, salty meat, feeling the grease coat her lips and throat. She looked around the dim, cramped cabin. She was 50 miles from anywhere, trapped in a blizzard with a scarred mountain man who had bought her like livestock. She took another bite of the pork. It was the best thing she had eaten in days. Caleb set his empty plate on the table. He looked across the small space at her. "Stove draws well when the wind blows from the north," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a simple statement of fact about the cabin. But Martha understood the subtext. He was including her in the knowledge of the place. "I'll keep it fed," Martha replied, her voice flat, devoid of the submissive tone she used to use with her father. Caleb gave a single, slow nod. He leaned back against the log wall, stretching his long legs out toward the heat. The boundaries were set. There was no romance here, no soft edges. It was a transaction of survival. But as Martha watched the firelight dance across the crude logs, she realized that for the first time in her 22 years, She wasn't taking up too much space. She fit perfectly in the brutal, heavy reality of the mountain. Winter slammed the mountain shut. By the third day, the snow drifts swallowed the lean-to and reached the roofline, burying the cabin in a silent, suffocating white tomb. Inside, time stretched, warped by the constant heavy darkness. There was no sunrise or sunset, only the dim orange glow of the cast-iron stove and the sputtering, foul-smelling light of tallow candles. Routine became their anchor. Survival in a 10-by-12-foot box demanded a brutal choreography. If Caleb moved to the left to fetch wood, Martha shifted right toward the water bucket. They existed in a tight, silent orbit, their bodies occasionally brushing in the cramped space. The coarse scrape of his wool sleeve against her heavy shoulder, the bump of his hip against hers as they navigated around the table. Martha waited for the explosion. In her father's house, confined spaces and proximity always bred violence. A bumped elbow meant a slapped face. A misplaced step meant a barrage of insults about her size, her clumsiness, her utter uselessness. Caleb never exploded. When she accidentally knocked a tin cup off the table, sending it clattering loudly onto the dirt floor, she flinched, her shoulders instinctively hunching up to her ears. Caleb merely glanced up from the steel trap he was oiling, registered that it wasn't a threat, and went back to his work. He didn't sigh. He didn't mutter under his breath. The absence of his anger was louder than any screaming she had ever endured. Her body, long despised for its bulk, began to adapt to the mountain's brutal mathematics. Down in Oakhaven, her fat was a mark of gluttony and shame. Up here, it was a biological furnace. One morning, the temperature inside this cabin plummeted so fast, the water bucket froze solid 3 feet from the stove. The wind outside sounded like a dying animal, shrieking through the granite crevices. Caleb was coughing, a deep, wet rattle in his chest that he tried to stifle into his elbow. Martha took the heavy steel axe from its peg. Caleb looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale beneath the heavy beard. "Wind's too high. Stay inside." "Woodbox is empty," she replied bluntly. "Unless you plan on burning the bed frame, I'm going out." She didn't wait for his permission. She shrugged into the massive buffalo coat, wrapped a torn wool blanket around her head and neck, and shoved the heavy plank door open. The cold hit her like a physical wall, stealing the breath from her lungs. She waded into the trench Caleb had dug to the woodpile, the snow reaching halfway up her thick thighs. The logs were frozen solid, encased in a hard shell of ice. A smaller woman would have bounced the axe right off the wood. Martha didn't swing from the shoulders. She used her entire mass. She planted her heavy boots, gripped the hickory handle with her scarred, swollen hands, and drove the steel down with 250 pounds of unadulterated, frustrated weight behind it. Crack! The pine split perfectly, a sharp, clean sound that cut through the howling wind. She swung again, and again. Her breath plumed in massive white clouds. Sweat pricked her scalp beneath the wool blanket, her heavy body generating a fierce, internal heat that pushed back the freezing air. For the first time in her life, she wasn't apologizing for her strength. She was weaponizing it. When she finally kicked the door shut behind her, dragging a canvas sling bulging with split wood, her lungs were burning and her hands were raw. She dumped the wood by the stove with a deafening clatter. Caleb was sitting on the edge of the rope bed, watching her. He had a tin cup of hot pine needle tea in his hands. He didn't say thank you. He didn't praise her strength. He stood up, walked to the stove, and picked up the heavy iron skillet. Inside were 2 thick slabs of salted elk meat he had fried while she was outside. He took the wooden spatula, slid the larger, thicker slab onto a tin plate, and set it on her side of the table. He took the smaller piece for himself. Martha stared at the plate. In her father's house, the men ate first, taking the prime cuts. The women ate what was left. The fat girl ate the scraps, and even then she was mocked for every bite. She looked up at Caleb. He was already chewing his meager portion, his eyes fixed on the fire. You gave me the bigger piece, she said, her voice rough, suspicious. You swung the axe. Caleb replied, not looking at her. You burn the fuel, you replace the fuel. Simple math. It wasn't affection. It wasn't chivalry. It was calorie math. It was the purest, most brutally honest thing anyone had ever said to her. Martha sat down at the table. She picked up a fork, her thick fingers trembling slightly, and ate the meat. It tasted like ash, salt, and absolute dignity. The fever hit him on a Tuesday. Caleb had gone out to check the close snare lines during a lull in the storm. He was gone for 3 hours. When the heavy door finally scraped open, he didn't step inside. He practically fell through the frame. Martha dropped the shirt she was mending. Caleb was on his hands and knees in the dirt, the door wide open behind him, letting in a swirl of biting snow. His breathing was a harsh, erratic rasp. "Shut the door!" he choked out, his voice thin and fragile, a sound completely alien to his massive frame. Martha lunged forward, grabbing the iron ring of the door and heaving it shut against the wind. When she turned back, Caleb had collapsed fully onto the floorboards. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her gut. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his snow-covered buckskins. "Caleb, get up. You have to get to the bed." He groaned, rolling onto his back. His eyes were open, but the pale blue irises were blown wide, tracking something she couldn't see. His skin was grey, pulled taut over his cheekbones, and he was shaking violently. A deep, sickening smell wafted off him, cutting through the scent of wet leather. It smelled like copper and rotten meat. Martha's eyes darted down his body. High on his left thigh, the buckskin pants were soaked in a dark, frozen slick of blood. "Oh, God," she breathed. "Bear trap," Caleb muttered, his head lolling to the side. "Ice broke. Slipped into my own damn set." He was a dead weight. 200 pounds of dense muscle and bone, completely incapacitated. Martha hooked her thick arms under his armpits. She planted her boots, braced her heavy thighs, and hauled backward. She dragged him across the dirt floor, grunting with the massive effort, until she got him to the rope bed. Getting him onto it was a desperate, ugly struggle. She had to use her knee to leverage his hips upward, her own breath tearing in her throat. When she finally rolled him onto the mattress, she was soaked in sweat. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy hunting knife from the table, gripped the thick leather of his pants right at the tear, and ripped upward. The seams popped with a harsh tearing sound. The wound was gruesome. The iron teeth of the trap hadn't just punctured the flesh. They had shredded it when he wrenched his leg free. The gash was 4 inches long, jagged and angry, oozing sluggish dark blood and thick yellow pus. The infection had set in fast, supercharged by the physical trauma and the cold. Caleb's eyes rolled back. His body arched violently off the bed as a massive shiver racked his frame. "Cold!" he gasped, his teeth clattering together. So cold. He was burning up. The heat radiating off his skin was terrifying. Martha spun around. She shoved a fresh log into the stove, ignoring the sparks that bit at her knuckles, and threw a tin pot of snow on the iron top. She found the small canvas bag of medical supplies Caleb kept on the top shelf. It held a needle, coarse thread, a bottle of clear, foul-smelling alcohol, and a few strips of clean linen. By the time the water boiled, Caleb was fully delirious. He was thrashing on the narrow bed, throwing his heavy arms out, muttering in a frantic, unbroken stream about ice and blood and someone named Sarah. Martha dragged a sump over to the bed. She dropped a rag into the boiling water, wrung it out with her bare, calloused hands, barely registering the scalding heat, and turned back to him. "Hold still!" she ordered, her voice hard, masking the raw terror in her chest. Caleb didn't hear her. As she pressed the scalding rag against the infected wound to clear the pus, he roared in agony. His fist flew out in a blind panic, catching Martha square in the jaw. The blow snapped her head back. She tasted blood instantly as her teeth cut into her cheek. The sheer force of it would have knocked a smaller woman to the floor. Martha just swallowed the blood, her jaw throbbing with a dull, heavy ache. He was going to kill himself thrashing, or he was going to force her to stop, and if she stopped, the infection would take his leg, and then his life. Martha didn't think. She acted on brute, physical instinct. She climbed onto the bed, straddling his massive chest. She pinned his right arm beneath her heavy knee and grabbed his left wrist with both hands, slamming it down against the mattress. "Stop!" she screamed right into his face. Caleb bucked beneath her, his immense strength surging through the fever. It was a terrifying, violent buck, an attempt to throw off the weight crushing him. But Martha was not a fragile, hollow-boned town girl. She was dense. She was heavy. She anchored her weight, driving her knees down, using the very bulk she had hated her entire life to smother his frantic movements. "I am trying to save your leg, you stubborn bastard!" she yelled, her face inches from his, spit flying from her lips. "Stop fighting me!" For a second, the flat blue eyes snapped into focus. He looked up at her, really looked at her, at the blood on her lip, at the sheer, unyielding mass of her, pinning him to the bed. He stopped fighting. The tension leaked out of his muscles, and he went limp, his head falling back against the mattress. "Do it!" he rasped, his eyes squeezing shut. Martha scrambled off his chest. Her hands were shaking violently now. She uncorked the bottle of alcohol and poured it directly into the open wound. Caleb let out a strangled, choked scream, his entire body going rigid, but he didn't thrash. She worked with brutal efficiency. She scrubbed the rotten flesh away, the smell of the infection gagging her. She threaded the needle with hands slick with his blood. It took 8 thick, crude stitches to pull the jagged edges of muscle and skin together. Every time the needle pierced his flesh, he shuddered, but he didn't fight her again. When she tied off the final knot, she collapsed back onto the dirt floor. She was panting, coated in sweat and blood, her jaw throbbing violently. Caleb was unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. For the next 3 days, Martha didn't sleep. The routine broke. The math of survival shifted completely to her shoulders. She chopped the wood. She melted the snow. She forced trickles of hot water and salt broth down his throat while he shivered in the grip of the fever dreams. She packed his leg with poultices of steeped pine needles and boiled roots, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that the red, angry lines crawling up his thigh would recede. On the evening of the 3rd day, the wind outside finally died down, leaving an eerie, ringing silence in its wake. Martha was sitting in the dirt beside the bed, her head resting against the rough wood of the frame. She was exhausted down to the marrow of her bones. She felt a movement. She lifted her head, her eyes gritty and burning. Caleb was awake. The glazed, frantic look was gone from his eyes. They were clear, pale blue, and fixed intently on her face. He looked terrible. Gaunt, hollowed out, his beard matted with sweat. He slowly lifted his hand. It was weak, trembling slightly. He reached out and brushed his rough thumb against the dark, purpling bruise on Martha's jawline where he had struck her. "You hit me," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "You hit me first," Martha replied, her voice flat, though a sudden tight knot formed in her throat. Caleb's thumb lingered on her jaw for a second longer than necessary. It was the first intentional, non-transactional touch between them since he had examined her hands in her father's parlor. "You didn't run," he noted, his hand dropping back to the bed. "You could have taken the mule, the supplies, waited for the storm to break." Martha looked at the heavy iron stove, glowing steadily in the dark. She thought of Oakhaven. She thought of her father tallying her worth in salted meat. Then she looked back at the scarred, broken mountain man lying in the filthy bed. "And go where?" she asked quietly. "I take up too much space down there." Caleb closed his eyes. a long, slow breath escaping his cracked lips. You fit just fine up here. Recovery was an ugly, humiliating business. It lacked the quiet dignity of suffering that preachers always talked about in Oakhaven. Caleb's fever broke, but it left behind a man stripped of his formidable strength, reduced to shivering exhaustion and a festering, stitched-up leg that required daily, agonizing care. Martha became the undisputed master of the cabin. She had to be. Caleb was confined to the rope bed, his heavy frame acting as a dead weight whenever he needed to shift. The dynamic had violently inverted. The man who had inspected her like a draft horse was now entirely dependent on her heavy, calloused hands. She emptied the foul-smelling tin bucket he used as a chamber pot. She boiled the rags. She took his rifle out into the biting grey mornings, tramping through waist-deep drifts to check the snare lines. The first time she brought back a snowshoe hare, its neck cleanly snapped by a brass wire, Caleb had watched her skin it from his bed. He watched the capable, unsqueamish way her thick fingers separated the hide from the meat, pulling the membrane free with a wet, tearing sound. He didn't offer advice on how to butcher it. He just watched. 2 weeks after the fever broke, the cabin walls started closing in on him. Caleb was a creature of the open air. Being trapped indoors was making him mean. He lay on the bed, staring at the turf ceiling, his jaw set in a hard, rigid line. Martha was at the stove, rendering down the last of the salt pork fat to make soap. The sharp, alkaline smell of lye stung the air, mixing with the ever-present scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. "I need to walk," Caleb announced abruptly. Martha paused, the wooden spoon freezing in the bubbling fat. She looked over her shoulder. He was already swinging his good leg over the edge of the mattress. The wounded leg followed, stiff and swollen, wrapped tightly in clean linen. "The stitches are barely holding," Martha said flatly. "You put weight on it, it'll tear open, and I am not sewing you back up." "I am standing up," he growled. It wasn't a request. He gripped the edge of the wooden bed frame, his knuckles turning white. His chest heaved as he forced himself upright. He stood on his right leg, swaying dangerously. Sweat beaded instantly on his forehead. He gritted his teeth and lowered his left foot, attempting to bear weight. The moment the sole of his foot touched the frozen dirt floor, his wounded leg buckled entirely. He pitched forward. He was 200 pounds of dense muscle and bone, falling like a felled tree toward the hot iron stove. Martha didn't scream. She moved. For a woman of her size, she possessed a startling, grounded speed. She lunged, planting her heavy boots wide, and caught him. The impact was brutal. Caleb's chest slammed into her shoulder, the air rushing out of his lungs in a sharp grunt. His sheer weight would have driven a smaller woman straight to the floor, crushing them both against the red-hot iron. Martha didn't go down. Her thick, trunk-like thighs absorbed the shock. She wrapped her massive arms around his ribs, digging her heels into the dirt. She let out a low, guttural groan, her heavy muscles straining violently against his falling momentum. She locked her knees, hauling him backward, away from the stove. They stood there for a long moment, locked together in the center of the cramped cabin. Caleb was breathing hard, leaning heavily against her broad chest, his arm draped awkwardly over her thick shoulder. Martha's heart hammered a frantic rhythm, but her stance was utterly immovable. She was holding up a grown, muscular man, and she wasn't breaking. Caleb slowly turned his head. His face was inches from hers. She could smell the stale sweat on him, the pine pitch in his beard, and the metallic tang of fear that had spiked when he started falling. He didn't pull away. He looked at her shoulder, then down at her thick waist, currently bearing the brunt of his weight. Then he looked into her eyes. The flat blue was gone, replaced by a deep, stark realization. "You're a rock," he rasped, his breath hot against her cheek. It was the highest compliment a mountain man could give. It wasn't about beauty. It was about permanence. It was about being an immovable force in a world entirely designed to kill you. I told you, Martha said, her voice shaking slightly from the physical exertion. I take up space. Good, Caleb murmured. Don't let me fall. I won't. She half carried, half dragged him back to the rope bed. When she finally deposited him onto the mattress, neither of them said another word about the incident. But the silence in the cabin had changed. It was no longer the tense, wary quiet of two strangers trapped together. It was the heavy, comfortable silence of a shared yoke. Spring did not arrive with blooming flowers and chirping birds. It arrived in a violent torrent of mud and noise. The ice on the high ridges cracked like cannon fire, sending avalanches of grey slush thundering down the ravines. The roof of the cabin leaked a constant rhythmic drip of snowmelt. The air inside finally lost its bitter, biting edge, smelling heavily of wet earth, rotting pine needles, and raw, newly thawed soil. Caleb was walking again. He had a severe limp, a heavy drag of his left boot that he would carry for the rest of his life. But the infection was entirely gone. The jagged scar on his thigh looked like a lightning strike carved into his flesh. Martha stood in the open doorway, letting the pale, watery spring sunlight hit her face. The buffalo coat had been shed weeks ago. She was wearing her old cotton dress, though it fit differently now. The relentless physical labor of chopping wood, hauling water, and dragging game had altered her bulk. She wasn't smaller, if anything her shoulders were broader, but the flesh was dense, packed hard like river clay. Behind her, Caleb was moving around the small table. He was packing the canvas saddlebags. Martha watched the swollen creek rushing violently past the clearing. The ice was gone. The pass was open. Town will be waking up, Caleb said behind her. The scrape of metal on wood echoed as he set something heavy on the table. Martha didn't turn around. Her chest tightened, a cold, heavy dread settling in her gut that had nothing to do with the winter weather. This was the end of the transaction. She had kept him alive, kept his fire burning, and now the snow was gone. The draft horse had served her purpose. I suppose they will be, she replied quietly. I put a fresh shoe on the roan yesterday, Caleb continued. His voice was casual, but there was a strange, tight cadence to it. Mule is packed with the spring furs, good pelts, thick winter coats. Martha finally turned. Caleb was standing by the table, leaning slightly on his good leg. In the center of the split logs sat a heavy leather pouch. It was larger than the one he had tossed to her father 6 months ago. What is that? She asked, her voice turning defensive, sharp. $75, Caleb said, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. Plus the roan, and the furs on the mule. You take them down to Oakhaven, you sell the pelts, you'll have enough to buy passage on a coach out of this territory. Go east. Go somewhere they don't look at a woman like livestock. Martha stared at the leather pouch. The money represented freedom. True freedom. She could leave her father, leave Oakhaven, leave the brutal, freezing mountain. She could go to a city where nobody knew she had been bought for $50 and 3 bear hides. She walked slowly toward the table. The floorboards creaked under her heavy boots. She stopped across from Caleb, looking down at the pouch, then up at his scarred, bearded face. He was watching her intensely, a muscle feathering in his jaw. He was offering her the door. You're paying me off? She asked, her tone dangerously quiet. I am paying a debt, Caleb corrected gruffly. You saved my leg. You saved my life. I don't hold slaves, Martha. You didn't ask to come up here. The pass is clear. You earned your way out. Martha felt a sudden, irrational surge of anger. It burned hot and bright in her chest. She had spent 22 years being told where to go, what to eat, how to stand, and how much space she was allowed to occupy. Even now he was deciding her fate, handing her a pouch of coins and pointing down the mountain. She reached out with her thick, calloused right hand. She didn't pick up the pouch. Instead, she swept her arm in a hard, violent arc, backhanding the heavy leather bag right off the table. It hit the dirt floor with a heavy, muted thud, coins clinking dully inside. Caleb flinched back slightly in surprise, his eyes widening. "I'm not going," Martha stated, planting her heavy hands on her hips, squaring her broad shoulders. She took up half the room, and for once she didn't try to shrink. Caleb stared at the pouch on the floor, then back at her. "Martha, down there you can have a real life. Down there I am a fat, useless joke." She interrupted, her voice booming off the low log ceiling. "Down there, I am something to be hidden in the back room when company comes. I freeze, I starve, and I hate myself every second of the day." She took a step closer to him, closing the distance, her physical presence immense and undeniable. "Up here I swung the axe, up here I hauled the meat, up here when you fell I caught you. I didn't buckle, I didn't break, I fit here." Caleb stood perfectly still. The wind howled softly outside, rustling the newly budded pine branches. He looked at the fierce, unyielding set of her heavy jaw, the flush of angry color in her cheeks, the sheer, undeniable power radiating from her thick frame. Slowly, the tension bled out of his shoulders. The rigid line of his mouth softened. He reached up, his rough fingers brushing against the collar of her faded cotton dress. "You do," he said quietly, his voice a low gravel scrape. "You fit just right." He didn't pull her into a desperate, sweeping embrace. That wasn't who they were. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the final inch between them, and rested his forehead against hers. His heavy hands settled onto her thick waist, not spanning it, but grounding himself against it. Martha reached up, her swollen, scarred fingers gripping his muscular arms. It wasn't a picture-perfect romance. They smelled of lye soap, old smoke, and sweat. They were scarred, heavy, and cynical. But as they stood together in the damp, cramped cabin, anchored by each other's weight, Martha knew she was finally, undeniably home. The mountain didn't care about pretty girls. The mountain only cared about what was strong enough to survive it, and they were going to survive it together. Survival in the high country isn't about pretty faces or sweeping romance. It is about grit, heavy bones, and the raw will to endure. Martha and Caleb forged a bond entirely out of necessity, finding belonging in the brutal winter that would have crushed anyone else. Did you love this gritty, realistic take on a frontier romance? If you want more stories where imperfections are strengths and survival is the ultimate love language, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with your fellow story lovers, and drop a comment below on what you would do today.